Learn English through story. Seduced by shadows. In a dimly lit corner of the ancient city of Atarnian, where cobblestone streets whispered tales of bygone eras, there lived a man named Elias Marrow. Elias was neither a hero nor a villain, but a man burdened by the weight of his choices, a dreamer with a taste for darkness, caught in the web of shadows that seduced him. Elias owned a small curio shop, nestled between a decaying apothecary and an abandoned inn. The shop, aptly named Forgotten Whispers, was a trove of peculiar artifacts, tarnished goblets, fractured mirrors, worn-out tomes, and trinkets that seemed to hum with an aura of forgotten secrets. Few dared to linger in the shop for long, for there was something about the air thick, heavy, and magnetic that drew one closer to the objects but repelled reason. Though he appeared content amidst his wares, Elias harbored a profound restlessness. His youth had been spent chasing dreams that always evaded him, leaving him with a bitter appreciation for their elusiveness. The shadows, however, offered him something different, an invitation to explore the boundaries of his desires. They whispered to him, not in words, but in feelings and spoken promises of fulfillment and escape. One stormy evening, a peculiar customer entered, Forgotten Whispers. She was clad in a cloak as black as the storm clouds overhead, her face obscured by a hood. Her presence filled the room with an almost palpable tension. She moved deliberately, her gloved fingers grazing the artifacts, as if searching for something lost. Elias, intrigued and wary, broke the silence. Looking for anything specific? The woman turned her head slightly, revealing eyes that shimmered like molten gold. I'm seeking an object not for sale, but for purpose, she replied cryptically. Elias felt the words stir something within him, a spark of curiosity that quickly flared into something more intense. Purpose, you say? This shop thrives on forgotten purposes. She smiled faintly. Indeed. And yet, I wonder if you truly understand what you possess. Before Elias could respond, she reached for an item he had almost forgotten, a small, obsidian box adorned with carvings of shadowy figures. The box, untouched for years, was a relic that Elias had never dared to open. He didn't know why, but every time he had tried, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, warning him away. Do you know what this is? The woman asked, her voice laced with something Elias couldn't quite place: reverence, perhaps, or fear. Elias shook his head. No one does. It's been here longer than I have. People say it's cursed. Cursed? She echoed, almost laughing. No, not cursed. Enchanted. This box holds the gateway to a realm where shadows come alive not as specters, but as possibilities. It is said that those who open it can reshape their realities, but at a cost. The air grew heavier, the dim light in the shop seeming to bend around them. Elias, unable to resist the pull of her words, asked, "What cost?" The woman hesitated, her golden eyes searching his face. The cost is different for everyone. For some, it is a memory. For others, a piece of their soul. But the reward is everything you've ever wanted, though you may not yet know what that is. Elias felt his heart race. A part of him wanted to dismiss her as another eccentric wanderer, but the shadows in the room seemed to cling to her words, amplifying their weight. "And you want this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to see if you're brave enough to claim it," she replied, her smile fading into an expression of grave seriousness. "The box chooses its master. It has chosen you." Elias looked at the obsidian box, its carvings seeming to shift under the flickering candlelight. For years, he had resisted the allure of the shadows, but now they beckoned him more strongly than ever. With trembling hands, he reached for the box. Elias' hands hovered over the obsidian box, his breath shallow. It wasn't the physical weight of the box that intimidated him, it was the enormity of its implied promise. The box felt cold, its surface smooth save for the intricate carvings that seemed to writhe under his touch. For a moment, he hesitated, glancing at the mysterious woman, who stood silent, her molten eyes betraying no emotion. "Why me?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. She tilted her head slightly. "Why not you? You've spent your life surrounded by shadows." Elias, every choice you've made, every dream you've abandoned, it all led you here. Perhaps it's not about why, but what you'll do with the chance. Her words struck a chord deep within him. The life he had carved out for himself, while comfortable in its monotony, had always felt incomplete. He thought of the days spent alone in his shop, the nights wrestling with dreams of a world larger than his own. The whispers in his mind were louder now, coaxing him forward. With a sharp breath, he unlatched the box. The room plunged into darkness as an inky vapor spilled out, wrapping itself around Elias like tendrils of smoke. His vision blurred, and he felt a pull not just physical, but spiritual, dragging him into a void. The world he knew dissolved, replaced by an endless expanse of shadow. Elias found himself standing on a plain of shifting black sands. Above him, the sky was a roiling mass of darkness, punctuated by faint glimmers of light that seemed impossibly far away. The air was thick, yet oddly breathable, and every sound he made echoed endlessly. "You've entered the threshold," the woman's voice echoed, though she was nowhere to be seen. "Here, shadows take form. Your desires, your fears, your regrets all will manifest. The question is, will you command them, or will they command you?" As her voice faded, the shadows around him began to shift. At first, they were amorphous, swirling shapes, but as Elias stared, they coalesced into forms, people, objects, moments from his past. The first figure to emerge was that of a young woman with auburn hair, and a laugh that once filled his days with light. Clara. Elias' chest tightened at the sight of her. She had been the love of his youth, a beacon of hope during his most turbulent years, but his obsession with chasing unattainable dreams had driven a wedge between them. Clara had left, and Elias had never found the courage to follow her or make amends. "Elias," her voice called out, soft yet laced with sadness. "Why didn't you fight for me?" He stumbled backward, shaking his head. "You left because I wasn't enough, because I couldn't give you what you deserved." "No," Clara said, stepping closer. Her form shimmered, half real, half shadow. "You chose the shadows over me. You always have. Even now, you're chasing them, aren't you?" Before he could answer, her figure dissolved, replaced by another, boy, no older than 10, with wide, frightened eyes. Elias' heart sank. He recognized the boy instantly, himself as a child. "Why did you give up on me?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. "I didn't," Elias whispered, his throat tight. "Yes, you did," the boy insisted. "You stopped believing in the world we dreamed of. You settled for this." He gestured at the endless expanse of shadows. "You let the darkness consume you." The weight of the boy's words crushed Elias. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. The shadows around him began to twist, taking on more forms: friends he had betrayed, opportunities he had squandered, versions of himself he had abandoned in pursuit of fleeting desires. "Enough," Elias shouted, his voice reverberating through the void. The shadows froze. The air grew still. "You cannot run from us," a voice echoed, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We are you. We are every choice you've made, every shadow you've embraced. Do you seek to control us, or will you let us consume you?" Elias rose to his feet, his fists clenched. "I didn't come here to be consumed. I came here to understand, to take back what I've lost." The shadows began to swirl again, this time merging into a singular form. It was him, a perfect reflection, yet darker, more imposing. This shadow version of Elias smirked, stepping forward. "To take back what you've lost," the shadow said, its voice dripping with mockery. "Do you even know what that is? You've spent your life chasing illusions, dreams that led you nowhere, people you pushed away. Tell me, Elias, what do you truly want?" Elias hesitated. The question cut deeper than he expected. What did he want? Redemption? Fulfillment? Love? The shadows around him pulsed, as if feeding on his uncertainty. I want a second chance," he finally said. "A chance to do things differently, to make things right." The shadow laughed, a low, menacing sound. "Second chances come at a price. Are you willing to pay it?" Elias nodded, though fear not at him. Yes. The shadow stepped closer, its dark eyes locking onto his. Then face your truths, Elias, all of them. Only then will you understand the cost. The ground beneath him trembled, and the shadows erupted into a whirlwind. Elias was pulled deeper into the void, each moment stripping away layers of himself. Memories, emotions, regrets, they all surfaced, raw and unrelenting. He relived his failures, his betrayals, his darkest moments. But amidst the pain, he also saw glimmers of light, acts of kindness, fleeting moments of joy, the potential he had once believed in. When the storm finally subsided, Elias stood alone. The shadow version of himself was gone, and the endless expanse of darkness had been replaced by a vast starlit sky. The obsidian box lay at his feet, closed once more. The woman's voice returned, soft yet firm. You have faced your shadows, Elias, but the journey does not end here. The question remains, what will you do with what you've learned? Elias picked up the box, his grip steady. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. The shadows had shown him his worst and his best, forcing him to confront the truth of who he was. He knew now that the cost of his second chance wasn't something external, it was the courage to change, to act, to face the light and the dark within himself. As he stepped back into the world, the whispers of the shadows faded, replaced by a new voice, his own, steady and resolute. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Elias felt ready to walk it. The shop returned to focus around Elias as the box closed with a soft click. The once thick air now felt oddly light, almost brittle. The mysterious woman was gone, leaving no trace of her presence save for the lingering sensation of her molten gaze. Outside, the storm had eased, but the shadows in the room felt different, alive, charged, as though they had been stirred into consciousness. Elias stared at the box in his hands, his fingers tracing its carvings. The symbols now pulsed faintly, their patterns shifting as though responding to his thoughts. He placed the box on the counter and slumped into a chair, his heart still racing. The encounter had shaken him to his core. The visions he had seen in the threshold, the reflections of Clara, the child he once was, and the shadowed version of himself were not mere illusions. They were pieces of his soul, fragments of truths he had long buried. And now, those truths felt as if they had taken root, waiting to grow into something he could neither predict nor control. For days, Elias avoided the box. He tried to return to the monotony of his daily life, tending to his shop and pretending nothing had changed. Yet the shadows in the room seemed to linger longer than usual, pooling in corners and shifting subtly when he wasn't looking. They whispered to him, faintly at first, then louder as the days went on. You opened the door, the whispers said, their voices intertwining like a chorus. You cannot ignore us. One evening, after hours of restless pacing, Elias finally gave in. He locked the shop door, drew the curtains, and lit a single candle. Sitting at the counter, he placed the obsidian box before him. What do you want from me? He asked aloud, his voice trembling. The shadows didn't reply in words. Instead, the carvings on the box began to glow faintly, and the room dimmed further until the candle's light was all that remained. The flame flickered, casting dancing shapes on the walls, shapes that grew and coalesced into figures. The first figure was Clara, her auburn hair shimmering as though illuminated by an unseen sun. She stood silently, her expression a mix of sorrow and longing. You left me, Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. You had every reason to. Clara's image tilted her head, her lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came. Instead, the shadows shifted again, and the boy appeared, the younger version of Elias, his wide eyes filled with both hope and fear. You gave up on me, the boy said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. You stopped believing in the dreams we had. Do you even remember what they were? Elias opened his mouth to respond, but found he couldn't. The words caught in his throat, and his mind scrambled for answers. What had he dreamed of as a child? To travel? To create? To love without fear? The memories felt distant, like faded photographs left too long in the sun. The shadows shifted once more, and the darker version of himself emerged. This time, the figure was more defined, its features sharper, its presence more imposing. "You don't know what you want," the shadow Elias said, its voice cold and mocking. "You've spent your life chasing shadows without even realizing it. And now, you're here, clinging to this box as though it holds the answers. But it doesn't." "Then what does?" Elias shot back, his frustration boiling over. The shadow smirked. "That's the question, isn't it? You've seen glimpses of your truth, but glimpses aren't enough. If you want answers, you'll have to go deeper. Face the shadows fully." Before Elias could respond, the shadow lunged forward, merging with the real Elias in a burst of darkness. The room spun, and Elias felt himself falling once more into the void. When he landed, he was back in the threshold, the plain of shifting black sands. This time, however, the space felt different, more turbulent, as though the shadows themselves were agitated. The sky above was no longer a swirling mass of darkness. It was split, half shadow and half light. The divide created an unnatural tension in the air, and the stars that had once been distant now seemed closer, brighter, as though urging him to reach for them. "Elias," a voice called out, soft, familiar. He turned to see Clara again, but this time, her form was fully real, her presence grounding. "Is this another illusion?" Elias asked, his voice wary. "No," Clara replied, stepping closer. Her hand reached for his, and he felt its warmth. "I'm not real, but I'm not an illusion either. I'm a part of you, the part you lost when you let me go." Elias felt a lump rise in his throat. "I didn't let you go. You left because you were too afraid to hold on," she finished for him. Her tone was gentle, but firm. "You pushed me away before I could leave, convincing yourself it was for the best. But it wasn't. You've been running from love ever since." Elias looked away, shame washing over him. "What was I supposed to do? I couldn't give you what you needed." Clara smiled sadly. "You never asked what I needed. You decided for me." Before he could respond, the sands around them shifted violently. The shadows surged upward, forming a towering wall that separated him from Clara. "Face it, Elias," her voice echoed from beyond the wall. "If you want to move forward, you have to stop running." The wall of shadows began to ripple, forming countless faces of people Elias had encountered throughout his life. Some he recognized instantly, old friends, fleeting lovers, customers from his shop. Others were strangers, their expressions unreadable. "You ignored us," the faces said in unison. "You turned away when we needed you. You chose the shadows over connection, over love." Elias clenched his fists. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know how to be enough for everyone." The faces morphed into a single, massive visage, his own. "Then learn," it said, its voice booming. "The shadows are not your enemy, Elias. They are your reflection. Accept them, and you'll find your path. Reject them, and you'll be lost forever." Elias stared at the visage, his mind racing. The truth was undeniable. He had spent his life running not just from others, but from himself, from the parts of him that felt unworthy, broken, and incomplete. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, his hand outstretched. As he touched the wall of shadows, a surge of energy coursed through him. The darkness didn't resist. It flowed into him, filling the empty spaces he hadn't even realized were there. When the shadows cleared, Elias found himself back in his shop, the obsidian box in his hands. But this time, the room felt different. The air was lighter, the shadows less oppressive. He looked around, and for the first time in years, he felt truly present. The box no longer glowed or shifted. Its purpose had been fulfilled, not as a source of power, but as a mirror to his soul. Elias placed it gently on the shelf, a faint smile on his lips. His journey wasn't over, but he was no longer afraid. The shadows within him had been embraced, not as enemies, but as guides. And as he opened the shop door to the morning light, he knew that his second chance had already begun. As Elias closed the door to his shop and stepped into the bustling streets of Atarnian, the warmth of the morning sun bathed his face. but the weight of his encounter in the threshold still lingered. The marketplace around him was as vibrant as ever, the air filled with the sound of vendors calling out their wares, children laughing, and the rustle of fabrics and leather. It was a typical morning in the city, but for Elias, the world felt strangely altered. Every face he passed seemed to hold a depth, as if they were not just strangers or familiar faces, but reflections of something larger, something that tied him to the world in ways he had never truly understood before. The encounter with the shadows, the box, and the strange woman had stripped away the layers of illusion he had so carefully constructed around himself. For the first time in years, Elias felt like he was standing on the precipice of something immense, a truth, a reckoning, and perhaps a redemption. But he wasn't sure what form it would take. He felt a pull toward the unknown, a sense that his journey had just begun, even though he had already faced so much. Elias walked aimlessly through the city streets, not entirely aware of where he was going. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What had happened in the threshold? What were the implications of the promises and choices the shadows had laid before him? He had embraced the darkness, but did that mean he had to become it? And what of Clara, his lost love? Had he truly accepted her departure? Or was he merely running from the pain of his past? As he passed a familiar street corner, Elias caught sight of a woman standing outside a bakery, her eyes locked onto him. Her face was partly obscured by the veil she wore, but her eyes, he knew those eyes. His heart skipped a beat. "Clara?" he whispered, unable to believe what he was seeing. The woman's eyes softened, and she took a tentative step forward. "Elias." Her voice was the same, a melody he had longed for, but had buried in the deepest corners of his heart. His breath caught in his throat. "But how? You left." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with an unreadable emotion. "I did, and you let me go. But I've been watching you, Elias, in ways you might not understand. I knew when you opened the box that it wasn't just for power. It was for something deeper, something you had to face in yourself." Elias felt the old guilt creeping in, but this time, it wasn't sharp or overpowering. It was a quiet understanding, a recognition of the truth. "I've spent so much of my life running from what I was afraid to confront, my fears, my mistakes, my failures. I thought I could hide from them, but the shadows, they've shown me something else. I've been running from myself." Clara smiled faintly, her voice laced with warmth. "We all have shadows, Elias. The question is whether we embrace them or let them control us. But running from them will never make them go away." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elias wanted to speak, to tell her how much he had changed, but the words eluded him. Instead, he reached out, his hand trembling. Clara hesitated for a moment before taking his hand in hers, the touch grounding him. Is this real?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's eyes flickered with sadness, but there was no bitterness. "This is real, but it's not the same as before. What you've learned in the shadows has changed you, and it has changed me too." Elias felt his heart pound in his chest. He wanted to hold on to this moment, to reclaim the love he had lost, but the weight of the shadows and the lessons they had imparted pressed on him. "I can't go back, Clara. I can't undo the past. I can't erase the choices I made. No one can," Clara said softly. "But you can move forward. We all have the power to change, to grow. And sometimes the first step toward that change is letting go." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Elias realized that his fear of losing Clara had always been about his inability to accept himself, his flaws, his regrets, and the shadows that had always been a part of him. He had thought love would save him from those shadows, but now he understood. Love wasn't about escaping the dark, it was about learning to live with it, to walk in it without being consumed. Clara's gaze softened, as if reading his thoughts. "I have to go now, Elias, but know this. You don't need me to complete you. You are enough as you are." With those final words, Clara stepped away, vanishing into the crowd. Elias stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her presence fading like a dream. But her words lingered in his mind, echoing through the chambers of his heart. He stood there for a long time, the bustle of the marketplace continuing around him. But the world felt quieter now. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew he couldn't go back to the life he had lived before. The shadows he had embraced had not consumed him. Instead, they had illuminated a path that was uniquely his to walk. As he turned and walked back toward his shop, Elias realized that the shadows had never been the enemy. They were a part of him, just as the light was. And now, he had learned to navigate both. He wasn't perfect, he would never be, but he was whole. And that was enough. When he returned to Forgotten Whispers, the shop felt different. The air was lighter, less oppressive. The shadows no longer loomed over him, but seemed to dance around him, a gentle reminder of the journey he had undertaken. He looked at the obsidian box, still sitting on the counter, its surface calm and unassuming. He didn't need to open it again. He knew now that the box was just a tool, a mirror that had reflected his deepest truths. But the real work had only just begun. Elias spent the next several months in quiet reflection. He continued running his shop, but he no longer saw it as a place of isolation. It was a place of connection. He opened his heart to those who came in, offering not just trinkets, but fragments of wisdom he had gleaned from his journey. He became a confidant, a listener, and slowly, people began to trust him, to open up to him in ways they hadn't before. And though the shadows still lingered because they always would, Elias had learned to walk with them, no longer afraid, no longer running. They were a part of him, and through them, he had found something more valuable than anything he had ever searched for himself. The morning light filtered softly through the cracked window of Elias' shop, casting long shadows across the worn wood of the floor. The storm had passed, but the air still felt thick with the weight of the experiences he had just endured. It was as though time had frozen, holding its breath, waiting for him to take the next step. Elias stood by the counter, his fingers resting lightly on the obsidian box. It no longer pulsed with eerie energy or whispered dark promises. Now, it was an ordinary object. Ordinary, and yet, Elias knew it held the key to his transformation, because the true power of the box was not in what it could give, but in what it had forced him to confront. He moved slowly toward the shop door, his steps deliberate. For a moment, he stood still, contemplating the threshold between the familiar world of his shop and the uncertain world outside. The shop had always been a refuge for him, a place of safety and routine, but now, it felt more like a prison, a cage built of his own making, fashioned from his fears, regrets, and unresolved longings. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the world seemed to breathe with him. The cobblestone streets of Atarnian stretched before him, bathed in the soft golden light of dawn. The city felt more alive, more vibrant than it had in years. Yet Elias knew that his perception had shifted. The world hadn't changed, it was his vision that had expanded. The shadows that had once haunted him were now part of him, woven into his soul like threads of a tapestry. And he had learned, in the darkness, how to see them not as enemies, but as guides. He walked aimlessly at first, letting the rhythm of his footsteps soothe his mind. The weight of his past, the crushing guilt that had clouded his every decision, no longer felt quite so suffocating. He had faced his past, confronted the shadows, and in doing so, had found the strength to let them go. But there were still pieces of his story that he had yet to reckon with. Clara, the name lingered in his thoughts like a haunting refrain. Her face, her voice, the quiet moments they had shared, each memory had resurfaced during his time in the threshold. She had been the love of his life, and yet, he had let her slip away. He had let the shadows of his own insecurities and ambitions cloud his ability to truly love her. But now, the lessons of the shadows felt clearer. Love, he realized, was not about perfection or certainty. It was about vulnerability, acceptance, and the willingness to be seen. His thoughts drifted to the boy, the young Elias, wide-eyed and hopeful. The child he had once been, full of dreams and untainted by the weight of the world. He had abandoned that child too, in his pursuit of fleeting ambitions, of hollow dreams. But the boy was still there, within him, waiting to be acknowledged. As Elias walked, he felt a pull, an invisible thread, guiding him toward a place he hadn't visited in years. The old park on the edge of the city, where he and Clara had spent their days in the early years of their relationship. The park had once been a sanctuary, a place of innocence and possibility. It had been there that they had made plans for the future, dreams of adventures and shared happiness. But it was also there that Clara had left him, her heart broken by his inability to commit, to truly open himself to her. Elias arrived at the park just as the sun reached its zenith, casting its warm light over the familiar benches and twisting paths. He walked slowly through the park, his footsteps soft on the grass, until he came to the old oak tree that had witnessed so many of their moments together. Its branches were thick with leaves, and its bark had weathered the years, much like Elias himself. He stood beneath it, letting the cool shade wash over him. And there, beneath the oak, he saw her again, Clara. She was sitting on the bench where they had once shared so many quiet moments, her eyes distant, as if she were lost in the same memories that had kept Elias captive for so long. Her auburn hair fluttered gently in the breeze, and her expression was one of calm contemplation. For a long moment, Elias simply stood there, watching her, as the weight of his emotions threatened to overtake him. The urge to run, to escape the vulnerability of facing her again, rose within him. But he had learned in the shadows, that running no longer served him. He had to face her, and more importantly, he had to face the part of himself that had failed her so many years ago. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and walked toward her. Clara looked up as he approached, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with everything unsaid, every moment that had been left hanging between them like an unfinished story. But Elias felt something shift within him. The fear, the guilt, the self-doubt, all of it seemed to dissipate as he stood before her. He was no longer the man who had been consumed by shadows. He was a man who had learned to live with them, to understand them, and to let them shape him into something stronger. Clara, he said, his voice steady, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that I hurt you in ways that I can never undo. But I need you to know that I've changed. I've learned, and I've finally understood the things I couldn't before. I've spent so many years running from the parts of myself that I couldn't face, and I ran from you too. I was afraid, and I didn't know how to love you the way you deserved. Clara didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze soft, but filled with an unreadable depth. Elias could feel his heart racing, his breath caught in his chest. He was afraid of what she might say, or worse, what she might not say. But then, slowly, she stood up and stepped closer to him. I never stopped loving you, Elias, she said softly, but I couldn't wait for you forever. I needed someone who could meet me halfway, someone who could share their heart with me, not just their dreams. You always wanted to be something more than you were, and you pushed me away in the process. I had to let you go because I couldn't keep losing myself in your shadows. Elias nodded, his heart heavy with the truth of her words. He had never truly allowed himself to be vulnerable with her, to let her in. He had always been consumed by his own internal battles, by his desire to escape the limitations of his reality. But he had learned something in the darkness. He had learned that it was only by facing those limitations and accepting them that he could truly be free. I understand, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. I understand now. Clara's expression softened, and for a moment, she reached out and touched his arm gently. I'm glad, Elias. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope you can finally find peace with yourself. She turned to leave, her figure retreating into the distance. But Elias remained rooted to the spot, watching her disappear into the park's winding paths. There was no more regret, no more longing, only acceptance. And as he stood there, beneath the old oak tree, he felt something within him shift once more. The shadows had been both his prison and his teacher. They had revealed his deepest fears, but also his greatest potential. Now, He could let them go. He could let go of the past, the guilt, and the self-doubt. He could step into the light not as a man defined by his shadows, but as a man who had learned to dance with them. Elias turned and walked back toward the city, the weight of the past now lighter on his shoulders. He was no longer running. He was no longer lost. For the first time in years, Elias felt free. This section continues Elias' journey toward redemption and self-understanding, focusing on the confrontation with Clara and his acceptance of his past actions. The narrative builds upon the themes of self-forgiveness and healing, highlighting the importance of vulnerability and facing the darkness within. The shop was quiet, but the silence was no longer oppressive. The shadows had retreated into the corners, no longer pulling at him or whispering their temptations. Elias sat at the counter, the light from the outside world gently filtering in through the dusty window panes. He had returned to the world, but it felt altered, calmer, yet richer with possibilities. The obsidian box sat on its shelf, dormant, no longer a thing of mystery, but a symbol of his journey into himself. As Elias ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the box one last time, he thought of the threshold. He thought of Clara, the boy, and the shadowed version of himself, their words still echoing in his mind. They weren't just voices from the past. They were pieces of him, fragments of truth that he had refused to face for years. The door to forgotten whispers creaked open, and Elias looked up. A familiar figure stepped into the shop, old Samuel, a regular customer who frequented the store for obscure books and old relics. Samuel's hair was long, and his eyes gleamed with a quiet wisdom. He had always been a quiet presence in the shop, never asking for much, but always lingering, as if drawn to the shadows in the corners. Elias smiled faintly and nodded toward him. "Good evening, Samuel. You're up early today." Samuel returned the smile, but his eyes were curious, scanning the room as if something had changed. "It's the light, Elias. There's a different kind of light today, almost like it's breaking through the dark." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the obsidian box. "That box, it's different. What have you done with it?" Elias swallowed hard, still unsure of how to explain what had happened in the threshold. How could he explain the visions, the confrontation with his own shadow, the reckoning with the choices he had made? Could he even find the words to describe the stillness that had settled over him since that moment? "It's nothing," Elias replied softly, shaking his head. "Just an old artifact. It doesn't hold any more secrets." He paused, the weight of his own words sinking in. Or maybe it never did. Samuel seemed to ponder that for a moment before he slowly approached the counter. "You know, Elias, some of the greatest mysteries are not what they seem on the surface. Some things," Samuel's gaze grew distant, "some things hold the answers you don't even realize you're looking for." Elias's heart skipped a beat. He had been so consumed by his own journey, so focused on the shadows within, that he had forgotten the people around him, forgotten how his choices had rippled outward, affecting those who crossed his path. Samuel's words resonated deep within him. The shadows had never been just his own. They were part of the world he lived in, part of the relationships he had left in the wake of his decisions. "I'm not the same person I was when you last visited, Samuel," Elias said, his voice trembling with vulnerability. "Learn something. Something I think I've always known but never wanted to admit." Samuel regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. "And what might that be?" "I've spent so much of my life running from the past, from my mistakes, from what I thought I could never fix." Elias stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the street. The world beyond seemed brighter, more alive than it had ever appeared to him before. "I thought the answers were in things, in objects, in the stories of other people. But now, I see that the answers have always been inside me, waiting to be faced." Samuel's silence was gentle, almost like an invitation. Elias turned to him, his expression somber. "I thought that if I could bury my regrets in the darkness, they would go away. But the truth is, every choice, every lost moment, those things don't disappear. They stay with you, in the shadows, growing stronger, more demanding." I've spent so long pushing them away. But now I see that I can't run anymore. Samuel gave a knowing nod. None of us can, Elias. Not forever. He paused, studying Elias carefully. But what will you do now? Will you face your regrets and let them go? Or will you allow them to define you? Elias swallowed, his hands trembling slightly as he turned toward the shelf. The obsidian box still rested there untouched. The shadows had not spoken to him in days, but he could feel them watching, waiting for him to take the next step. I'm not sure, Elias confessed. I don't know what the right thing is to do. But you're trying, Samuel said gently, and that's all anyone can do. Sometimes facing your regrets isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about accepting that it was always part of you, and choosing to move forward anyway. Elias stared at the box, his mind swirling with everything he had learned. He thought of Clara, the love he had lost, the childhood dreams that had faded into the shadows, and the man he had become. He thought of the boy, the one who had hoped, who had believed, before life had chipped away at him. The boy who had dreamed of a world full of light and possibility. Maybe it's time to stop running, Elias said softly, more to himself than to Samuel. Maybe it's time to forgive myself. As he spoke the words aloud, something in him shifted. The weight of years of guilt and self-doubt seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. It was as though the very act of admitting it, of acknowledging his own pain and flaws had given him the strength to move beyond them. Samuel smiled, his eyes soft with understanding. You've taken the first step, Elias. That's the hardest one. As the shop fell silent once again, Elias stood there, feeling a quiet peace settling over him. He had opened himself to the shadows, to the dark places inside him, and in doing so, he had found the courage to seek the light. But the journey wasn't over. The shadows still whispered in the corners, reminders of his past, of all the choices he had made, and the ones still waiting to be made. The world was vast, and he had only just begun to navigate it. Elias walked over to the counter, gently lifting the obsidian box. The carvings were still faintly glowing, but now they seemed more like patterns of old memories, signposts that would guide him, not traps to ensnare him. He placed the box in the back of the shop, far from his daily reach. It had fulfilled its purpose. He no longer needed it to define him. He wasn't afraid of the shadows anymore. They were part of him, as much as the light. He had learned that facing them was the only way to reclaim his life. And now, he was ready for whatever came next. In the days that followed, Elias began to open up to the people around him. He reached out to those he had once pushed away, friends, old lovers, and even strangers who had crossed his path. He found that the more he embraced his own imperfections, the more others seemed willing to meet him halfway. The whispers of the shadows faded into quiet lessons, and Elias, no longer seduced by the dark, became a man reborn, aware of his flaws but unafraid of them. He would continue to make mistakes, but he would no longer be haunted by them. The world had become a place full of both light and shadow, and Elias had learned to live within its balance. And as the days turned to months, Elias could feel it. The past, once an endless weight, had become a foundation, no longer something to escape, but something to build upon. Elias was finally free. Elias stood alone in the quiet of the shop, the early morning light filtering in through the dust-dappled windows. He had expected to feel relief after the tumultuous experience in the threshold, the surreal landscape of shifting shadows that had forced him to confront the most painful parts of himself. But instead, there was a curious stillness, a quiet sense of understanding that hummed in his chest. He hadn't expected it, but he had come to realize something profound. The shadows were not just elements of darkness and fear, but integral pieces of his identity, parts of himself he had long neglected or rejected. He felt lighter, but not in the way he had imagined. It was not as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Rather, it was as if he had finally learned how to carry it, to accept it as a natural part of his existence. His past, his regrets, his fears, and even his failures were not things to be erased or buried. They were things to be acknowledged and understood. The obsidian box remained on the shelf, undisturbed. Elias felt no desire to open it again, for the answers it held were no longer locked inside. The shadows had given him the key, but it was he who had chosen to use it. And now, the box was no longer a source of temptation, it was a symbol of his own growth. As the day wore on, Elias found himself lost in the quiet routine of the shop. He dusted shelves, sorted through trinkets, and straightened the cluttered piles of books. The shop had always been his refuge, a place where he could hide from the world, from the part of himself that was restless and unfulfilled. But today, something felt different. The space that had once seemed oppressive now felt welcoming, full of possibilities. It was as if the shadows themselves had whispered a secret to the very walls of the shop, infusing the air with a quiet energy that stirred his soul. Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose, not just in his work, but in his life. He didn't need to chase dreams anymore, or pursue illusions of greatness. He didn't need to be someone he was not. The man who stood in the shop now was a man who had faced his own darkness and emerged on the other side, unbroken and whole. He thought about Clara, the image of her face, her eyes. Her smile had stayed with him even after the shadows had dissipated. The realization that he had let her go because of his own fear, because he had been too consumed with his own illusions of who he should be, struck him like a blow to the chest. He had never truly fought for her, never fought for the love they had shared. In his pursuit of abstract dreams, he had forgotten the tangible, real connection they had once shared. With newfound clarity, Elias knew what he had to do. He couldn't undo the past, but he could make amends. He couldn't change the mistakes he had made, but he could start making choices that aligned with the person he wanted to be, the person he was learning to be. Through the shadows, the phone on the counter rang, pulling him from his thoughts. Elias glanced at it for a moment, uncertain whether to answer. But then, a sense of urgency swept over him. He reached for the receiver. "Hello?" he said, his voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end before a familiar voice replied. "Elias?" Clara's voice was soft, almost tentative. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear from her, especially not after so much time had passed. He hadn't even known where she was, what she was doing. Their last conversation had been filled with too much pain, too many unspoken words. He had expected her to disappear from his life completely, a lost love, a memory too painful to revisit. "Clara?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, it's me," she replied. There was a hesitation in her tone, but also something more, something that suggested vulnerability, as though she had been carrying a weight too long, just as he had. "I didn't expect to hear from you," Elias said, unsure of how to proceed. I didn't think you wanted to speak to me after everything." "I don't know what I want, Elias," Clara admitted. Her voice was raw, like she had been holding something back for a long time. "I've been thinking about us, about everything, about why things fell apart." Elias felt a lump in his throat. "I know why," he said softly. "I pushed you away. I let my own dreams, my own fears, get in the way of what really mattered. I wasn't there for you when you needed me. I didn't fight for you. I wasn't enough." "No," Clara interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "You were enough. I think I finally understand that now. I left because I was afraid, too, Elias. Afraid that I couldn't live up to the person you were trying to be, the person you thought you needed to be. I thought you didn't really see me, not in the way I needed to be seen. But I was wrong." Elias felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. "I never understood what you needed," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought I had to be something, someone else, someone more." There was silence on the other end of the line. And then, Clara's voice came through, softer, almost tender. "Maybe we both did. Maybe we were both trying to be someone we weren't. But that doesn't mean it's too late." Elias closed his eyes, feeling a rush of emotion surge within him. "Is it too late?" "I don't know," Clara answered truthfully. "But I'm willing to find out. If you are." For the first time in years, Elias allowed himself to believe in something without the weight of fear or doubt. The shadows had shown him the truth of who he was: broken, flawed, but capable of growth. And now, Clara was offering him a chance to rebuild something that had once been broken. A chance to build a future, not based on illusions, but on acceptance and honesty. "I am," Elias whispered, a smile forming on his lips. "I'm willing to find out." After they hung up, Elias stood in the middle of the shop, feeling as though the air itself had shifted. The shadows no longer loomed menacingly over him. They had transformed into something else, something softer, more forgiving. He was no longer running from them. Instead, he had begun to accept them, to let them guide him, to find strength in their presence. Elias knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and perhaps even setbacks. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt as though he had the strength to face them, armed with the understanding that he could never escape the shadows, but he could learn to walk with them. The shadows, after all, were not his enemies. They were part of his story, and they were teaching him every day how to be whole. Elias spent the next few days in a state of quiet contemplation. The obsidian box remained untouched on its shelf, as if it had lost its power after being opened. The shadows in the shop, though still present, no longer pressed upon him as they had before. They no longer whispered insistent temptations, coaxing him into the world of darkness. Instead, they seemed to have retreated to their rightful place, lurking in the corners of his mind, rather than pulling at him from the edges of reality. He had learned something in the threshold, something beyond mere answers. The truth was not a singular destination to be reached, but a series of revelations, each one bringing him closer to the person he needed to become, rather than the one he had been. He had spent so much of his life looking outward at the dreams he never realized, the people he had abandoned, the opportunities that slipped away that he had failed to look inward. Only by confronting the darkness within him had he truly begun to understand what it meant to be whole. The quiet was, at first, unnerving. Elias had become accustomed to the noise of his own discontent, to the perpetual hum of yearning that had defined his life. But now, without that inner clamor to distract him, he began to notice the small details of the world around him. The crackling of the fire in the corner of the shop, the steady rhythm of his breath, the light that streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floors. It was these simple moments that felt most real to him now. He felt more connected to the world, as if he had re-entered it after years of wandering in a haze. He could almost taste the air more clearly, smell the rain-soaked earth outside. But despite this newfound clarity, the shadows still lingered, not as an overwhelming force, but as a reminder of what he had faced and what he had yet to confront. It was on the 5th day after his encounter with the box that the first customer returned, a middle-aged man, thin and hunched, with a nervous energy about him, entered the shop. Elias recognized him immediately as the kind of customer who often visited the curio shop, someone seeking answers, something to ease their own restless soul. The man's eyes scanned the shelves, his movements erratic, as if he were looking for something elusive, something that would give him peace. "Can I help you?" Elias asked, his voice steady. The man turned, startled, as though he had forgotten Elias was there. He glanced at the counter and then back at Elias, his lips trembling. I've heard rumors," the man said, his voice wavering, "about this shop, about what it can do." Elias raised an eyebrow. He had never been one to indulge in fantastical rumors, but he had heard whispers in the streets, 2 stories about the strange energy that seemed to radiate from his shop, the artifacts that seemed to possess an almost otherworldly quality. Rumors? What kind of rumors? Elias asked cautiously. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They say you have a box that can grant wishes, a box that shows the truth." His eyes flickered to the back of the room, where the obsidian box sat in its dark corner. Elias felt a tight knot form in his chest. The box had once held a promise of power, of answers, but he knew now that its true purpose had never been to fulfill desires. It had been a reflection, a mirror to one's soul, offering no illusions, only the harsh truth of who you were and what you had become. I'm afraid the box is not what you think it is, Elias said slowly, his voice quiet. It doesn't grant wishes. It only shows you what you need to see. But what you'll find may not be what you want. The man's face darkened, a flicker of something like fear crossing his features. But that's exactly what I need. I need to know. I need the answers. I've done things, terrible things, and I can't live with myself anymore. I heard if you open the box, it can help. It can make things right. Elias met the man's gaze, his mind swirling with memories of his own experiences with the box. The path it had forced him to walk was not an easy one. It had torn him apart and rebuilt him, piece by piece. And the truth, though liberating, was not always kind. You think it will absolve you, Elias said, his voice low. But no one can absolve you but yourself. The box can show you the truth, but it can't erase your past. Only you can do that by accepting who you are, and by facing the consequences of your actions. The man shook his head, his eyes pleading. I don't know if I can face it. The things I've done, the people I've hurt, I don't know how to move on from that. Elias looked at the man, his heart aching with the weight of his words. He understood the feeling of being consumed by regret, of living with the knowledge that certain actions could never be undone. And yet, there was still hope that, like him, the man could find redemption not in escaping the past, but in confronting it with courage. You can move on, Elias said softly, not by forgetting, but by accepting what happened. The shadows in your past don't have to control you. You have the power to take ownership of them. The man hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. I'll try, he said quietly. Elias smiled faintly. That's all anyone can do. The man left the shop shortly afterward, and Elias returned to his thoughts. He wondered how many others like the man had crossed his threshold, seeking answers or escape, and how many had, like him, found that true healing came not from avoiding the shadows, but from embracing them, understanding their place in the story of their lives. As the days passed, Elias found himself thinking more and more about his own journey. He realized that the shadows, both within and without, were not enemies to be vanquished, but parts of him to be integrated into the whole. The shadows had taught him to face the truth, to embrace his flaws and his regrets, and to find peace in their acceptance. And in doing so, he had discovered a deeper kind of freedom, a freedom not from pain, but through it. He began to open the shop to more visitors, each one carrying their own burdens, their own secrets. And with each encounter, Elias found himself becoming more comfortable in his own skin, more at peace with the man he had once been, and more accepting of the man he was becoming. The obsidian box remained on its shelf, no longer a source of temptation or fear, but a symbol of the journey he had undertaken. Elias no longer sought the answers it might offer. He had learned through the shadows to trust himself, and as the seasons changed, and the city of Atarnian continued to shift and grow, Elias understood that he had finally found his place not in the shadows, but in the light of his own truth. Time passed in a strange haze for Elias, a blur of days that blended together as he continued to serve his customers, tend to his shop, and wrestle with the thoughts that lingered in his mind. But the change in him was undeniable. The obsidian box, now sitting quietly on its shelf, had become a symbol of a journey that had reshaped his very understanding of life, of truth, and of the shadows that had once controlled him. The days began to lengthen as summer arrived in Atarnian, and Elias felt the pull of the world outside his shop. He had once been content to remain in the safety of his little space, surrounded by curiosities and secrets, hidden away from the harshness of the world. But now, the world outside seemed less daunting. The world seemed to welcome him, to offer him chances he had long denied. It was during one such day, when the sun bathed the cobblestone streets in a warm, golden light, that a familiar figure entered his shop. The figure was tall, with a strong, confident presence, and yet there was a shadow in his eyes, an unspoken weight that seemed to draw him toward Elias. It was Thomas, An old acquaintance from Elias's past, someone he hadn't seen in years. The two had once been friends, sharing laughter and dreams. But time had a way of fracturing even the strongest of bonds. Thomas had changed since their last meeting. He looked older, his face creased with age and worry, his clothes worn and faded. But there was still that spark of recognition in his eyes. "Elias," Thomas said, his voice rough but sincere. "I heard you opened the shop again." Elias smiled faintly. "I did. It's not much, but it's enough." Thomas glanced around, eyeing the rows of strange objects and the quiet aura of the place. "It's good to see you. I didn't expect to find you here, still chasing oddities and mysteries." "Not chasing," Elias replied, his tone reflective. "I'm learning to accept them." Thomas chuckled softly. "I always wondered, Elias, what was it that drew you to the dark? The things people usually avoid, the shadows, the secrets. What was it that you were trying to find?" The question hung in the air, and Elias found himself staring at his old friend, realizing that Thomas had never truly understood his path. No one had. Not really, not even Clara, not even the people closest to him. They had all seen the obsidian box, the books, the arcane symbols, and thought Elias was searching for power, for some hidden treasure. But they hadn't seen the fear, the need to understand himself, to confront the parts of him that he had long buried. "I was looking for understanding," Elias said quietly, "for answers to things I didn't know how to ask. But what I found was more than I could have ever imagined." Thomas studied him for a moment, his brow furrowing. "You've changed, Elias. There's something different about you. You seem at peace." Elias nodded, his gaze shifting to the box on the shelf. "I've faced things in the shadows, things I was afraid to confront. And through that, I learned that the shadows are not our enemies. They're part of us." Thomas shook his head, confused. "I don't know if I understand." Elias took a deep breath. "You will, but it takes time. We all have parts of ourselves that we hide away. We bury them because they scare us. But those parts don't disappear. They grow stronger in the darkness, pulling us away from who we really are. I used to be afraid of the shadows, but now I see they hold the key to everything." Thomas fell silent, his eyes narrowing as if searching for the truth in Elias's words. There was a long pause before Thomas spoke again, his voice quieter now, filled with vulnerability. "I don't know how to live with the things I've done," Thomas admitted. "The choices I've made, they haunt me. Every night I lay awake, thinking about them. I don't know how to face them, Elias. I don't know how to move on." Elias's heart tightened as he listened. He knew that pain, the kind that gnawed at the edges of your soul, the kind that made you feel like a stranger in your own skin. He had once been that man, consumed by guilt and regret, running from the shadows of his own past. But now, he knew, there was a way forward. "You don't have to face it alone," Elias said gently. "The truth is, Thomas, you're never alone. The shadows are just reflections of the things we don't want to see, but they can be guiding lights too. They can show you who you are, what you need to face, and how you can heal. You just have to accept them." Thomas's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time in years, Elias saw the man he had once known, the man who had laughed with him in the light of their youth, the man who had shared his hopes and dreams. That man was still there, buried beneath the weight of his regrets, but he was still there. "You've always been able to see things clearly," Thomas whispered. "I wish I could understand it the way you do." "You will," Elias said. "It just takes time." With that, the two men stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, yet united by a shared understanding. Thomas didn't ask about the box. He didn't need to. Elias knew that his friend was on his own path now, a path that would eventually lead him to the same truth Elias had discovered, that facing the shadows was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. As Thomas left the shop, Elias felt a quiet satisfaction wash over him. He had shared his truth with someone else, and that was enough. He didn't need to convince anyone or change their minds. The journey was personal, and each person would have to walk it in their own time. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The shop continued to thrive. and Elias found himself more engaged with the world than he had ever been. He made amends with his past, mended broken relationships, and allowed himself to feel joy without the constant shadow of guilt and regret hanging over him. One day, as the sun set behind the horizon, Elias sat on the front steps of his shop, looking out over the city. He was at peace, not because life was perfect, but because he had finally made peace with the imperfections within himself. He had come to understand that the journey of life was not about escaping darkness, but about embracing it, seeing it, understanding it, and learning to live with it. The obsidian box sat quietly on its shelf, no longer a source of fear or temptation. It was simply a reminder of the path he had walked, a path that had led him from the shadows of his own soul to the light of understanding. Seduced by Shadows teaches us that the greatest journey we can undertake is the one within ourselves. We all have parts of our past, of our nature, that we wish to bury or ignore. These shadows, the regrets, the pain, the mistakes, often feel like enemies, but they are, in fact, reflections of who we are. Embracing these shadows, accepting them, and understanding them is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. Only by confronting the darkness within can we truly move toward the light of self-acceptance, forgiveness, and growth. The story reminds us that redemption doesn't come from escaping our past, but from accepting it, learning from it, and finding peace in who we have become because of it. Shadows are not something to be feared. They are integral to our story, and through them, we can find clarity, wisdom, and healing. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoy, then please like and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel.